Imagine standing at the gates of El Escorial Palace on a cold October morning in 1784. The bells toll, the banners wave, and Spain welcomes a new prince into the world. His name, Ferdinand, son of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma. To the cheering crowds, he was the promise of stability for a kingdom, already trembling under the weight of corruption and decline. But behind the gilded doors of the palace, those who understood the truth whispered something far darker. This child was born cursed. Not cursed by witches or sorcery, but by something far more destructive: centuries of royal inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons had long believed that the purity of their bloodline mattered more than the strength of their heirs. Cousins married cousins, uncles took nieces as wives, and generation after generation twisted the genetic dice until the results could no longer be ignored. Madness, deformity, and frailty haunted their courts, and Ferdinand would embody all of it in ways the world had never seen before. From infancy, he was a sickly child. He suffered fevers, digestive problems, and strange growth spurts that left court physicians puzzled. His tutors noted his nervous temperament, quick to anger and easily embarrassed. But it was in adolescence that the true nature of his inherited curse began to reveal itself. At first, the whispers were confined to the royal doctors. They noted, in coded Latin phrases hidden deep in Vatican archives, that the young prince's anatomy was unusual. What began as a curiosity soon became a horror. By his teenage years, Ferdinand's body had developed in ways that defied both medical science and the classical ideals of masculine beauty. In an era when the perfect man was imagined in the sculpted proportions of Greek statues, lean, symmetrical, refined Ferdinand was grotesquely different. His sexual organ was not just oversized, it was monstrously misshapen. Physicians described it with metaphors that seemed almost surreal. A billiard cue, a twisted club, a grotesque rod that widened and narrowed unpredictably. The psychological toll on the young prince was devastating. In the court of Madrid, where appearances meant everything, Ferdinand became the object of cruel whispers. Servants giggled behind their hands. Foreign envoys sent mocking reports back to Paris, Vienna, and London. Even his tutors, though careful in their words, struggled to conceal their unease. For Ferdinand, every bow, every smile, every chuckle in the palace corridors became proof that he was being mocked. And often, he was. That sense of humiliation festered into resentment. Here was a boy who should have grown into a confident monarch, but instead internalized the belief that his very body was a cosmic joke. While other princes learned diplomacy and the art of statecraft, Ferdinand learned suspicion. He learned how to glare at courtiers until they averted their eyes. He learned that power could silence laughter, even if it could not erase it. And most tragically, he began to believe that cruelty was the only answer to shame. Thus, by the dawn of the 19th century, Spain was not simply raising a king. It was raising a man whose body had betrayed him and whose bitterness toward that betrayal would one day shape the destiny of an entire nation. By the time Ferdinand reached marriageable age, the whispers in the palace had grown into a roar. Spain needed an heir. The court needed stability, and Europe's great powers needed assurance that the Bourbon dynasty would endure. But beneath the glittering surface of diplomacy and ceremony, everyone who dealt with Ferdinand carried the same unspoken question. How could a man so malformed, so mocked by nature, possibly fulfill his royal duty? The answer, as it turned out, was with secrecy, cruelty, and a kind of desperation that would destroy the women forced into his bed. In 1802, Ferdinand married Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, his first cousin. She was young, beautiful, and naive, raised on romantic tales of royal marriages. When she entered Madrid, she expected a fairy tale life, a handsome husband, a glittering court, and the honor of becoming Queen of Spain. What she found instead was a nightmare. On their wedding night, Ferdinand's valet delivered strange requests to the Queen's ladies in waiting: cushions, ointments, implements that looked less like instruments of romance and more like tools from a surgeon's chamber. The young bride had no idea what awaited her until Ferdinand disrobed. Her reaction, recorded in the private letters of horrified attendants, was nothing short of hysteria. She screamed, pointed, and called him a monster. And perhaps, in that moment, she wasn't entirely wrong. What followed was not a wedding night but a medical ordeal. Ferdinand's physicians, already accustomed to his condition, instructed Maria Antonia on the bizarre and painful procedures required for intimacy. Special cushions had to be arranged to support him. Laudanum was administered to calm her terror. What should have been an act of union between husband and wife instead resembled a grim ritual performed with clinical detachment. For Ferdinand, the humiliation deepened. For Maria Antonia, trauma took root. Over the next 5 years, their marriage became a cycle of failed pregnancies, miscarriages, and escalating cruelty. Twice, Maria Antonia conceived, and twice, she lost the child, once in the 4th month, once near term in a bloody and nearly fatal labor. Each loss pushed her deeper into despair until she was addicted to laudanum, her body frail and her spirit broken. By 1807, she was dead at just 21 years old. The official cause, fever. The whispered truth, despair and exhaustion from years of marital horror. But Ferdinand did not mourn as a husband should. Instead, he blamed her. He accused Maria Antonia of sabotaging pregnancies, of poisoning herself, of conspiring with enemies to deny him an heir. The death of his young wife did not soften his heart, it hardened it into something darker. Yet Spain still demanded a queen, and Ferdinand still demanded an heir. In 1816, he married again, this time to Maria Isabel of Portugal. She was only 19, cheerful and full of hope. But her optimism was crushed almost immediately. On her wedding night, the same screams echoed through the palace halls, this time hers. Servants later spoke of blood-stained sheets, broken furniture, and a queen whose eyes seemed permanently haunted from that day forward. Maria Isabel suffered nervous fits, nightmares, and visible trauma. She flinched whenever her husband entered the room, and her ladies-in-waiting reported that she sometimes awoke shrieking from dreams of monsters. In her fragile state, she miscarried soon after conceiving, and by 1818 she was dead officially from nervous exhaustion, but in truth from a body and mind shattered by terror. Ferdinand's pattern repeated itself a third time with Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony. Unlike her predecessors, she approached the marriage clinically, almost scientifically, keeping notes of their attempts at intimacy. But even her rational detachment could not overcome the impossible reality of Ferdinand's deformity. After 10 years of mechanical, medically supervised encounters, she finally conceived. Spain rejoiced at last, an heir. But the child, a daughter, died hours after birth. Maria Josepha herself followed weeks later, succumbing to infection and despair. 3 wives, 3 funerals, no heir. For most men, such tragedies might inspire reflection or remorse. For Ferdinand, they confirmed his paranoia. He became convinced that fate itself was conspiring against him. His response was not sorrow, but fury toward his wives, toward his physicians, toward anyone who dared whisper about his failures. By the time he took a 4th wife, Maria Cristina of Naples, Ferdinand had abandoned any pretense of romance or normalcy. Maria Cristina was already pregnant when she arrived in Spain. Her child, Isabella II, clearly not Ferdinand's by blood. Yet he accepted the deception. He had to. For him, it was not about love, or even truth. It was about the appearance of legitimacy, the illusion of triumph over the curse that had haunted him since birth. And yet, deep inside, Ferdinand knew the truth. His marriages had been mausoleums, his wives their unwilling sacrifices. Every scream, every miscarriage, every coffin lowered into the ground was another reminder that his most private shame was also Spain's most public tragedy. By the time Ferdinand had buried his 3rd wife, the line between his private torment and his public rule had dissolved. What had begun as a personal curse, his grotesque deformity, his humiliating failures in the bedchamber, was now spilling over into the throne room, poisoning the way he governed the nation. Spain was no longer ruled by a monarch in the traditional sense. It was ruled by a man who saw mockery in every bow, betrayal in every whisper, and conspiracy in every shadow. His paranoia had been building since boyhood, when servants giggled behind closed doors. But now, with the crown on his head, that paranoia hardened into policy. He surrounded himself with spies and informants. Entire networks of servants were tasked not with cleaning or cooking, but with reporting who laughed, who lingered too long in conversation, who might have muttered about the king's condition. The royal palace became less a home than a fortress of surveillance, its corridors filled with eyes and ears. Ferdinand began keeping lists. Lists of courtiers who had once smirked in his presence. Lists of ministers who dared correct him in council. Lists of foreign envoys who had sent mocking reports back to their homelands. These lists were not symbolic. One by one, the names were crossed out as men disappeared, exiled, imprisoned, or quietly executed. To the public, the king styled himself as a defender of tradition, of faith, of Spain's honor. But behind the facade, it was clear he was waging a private war against ridicule itself. The more he silenced others, the more convinced he became that they were laughing at him anyway. He imagined whispers in every corner. He insisted on secret passageways through the palace so he could move unseen, spying on his own ministers. He had mirrors installed at strategic angles, convinced that even the walls might be hiding smirks. What began as a defense of his dignity soon warped into a suffocating obsession. And yet, Ferdinand's cruelty was not only directed at courtiers, it reached into the most intimate corners of his life. When servants accidentally glimpsed him disrobed, they did not simply lose their posts, they disappeared. Pages who stumbled into his chambers were flogged, their families banished from Madrid. To Ferdinand, no one could witness his shame and remain alive to speak of it. This same cruelty infected his political dealings. In 1807, when he was caught conspiring against his father Charles IV with the aid of Napoleon Bonaparte, Ferdinand did not defend his allies. He betrayed them instantly, handing over names and confessions in exchange for mercy. To those who had risked their lives for him, it was a shocking act of cowardice. But for Ferdinand, betrayal was simply another tool, another way to silence those who might someday whisper about his failures. His paranoia was fed by his own body. Court physicians noted with horror that his deformity was not static, it continued to grow and change shape, as though mocking him further with each passing year. Some believed he suffered from a rare hormonal disorder that caused abnormal, continuous growth. Whatever the cause, Ferdinand's despair deepened. Every attempt at intimacy required new contraptions, new rituals, new humiliations. His palace workshops became a grotesque blend of medical laboratory and torture chamber, crafting marital devices so elaborate that foreign artisans later whispered about them in dread. Ferdinand's wives became unwilling participants in these rituals, their screams echoing through the halls. But while the women suffered physically, Ferdinand's mind twisted further. He convinced himself that their revulsion was not natural but treasonous. He accused them of conspiring with foreign powers, of deliberately sabotaging pregnancies, of mocking him in secret letters. Each failed attempt at conception became, in his eyes, not a tragedy of biology, but an act of rebellion. By the time Maria Isabel and Maria Josepha lay in their coffins, Ferdinand's capacity for empathy was gone. He had become a man incapable of seeing others as human beings. Wives were tools for producing heirs or failures to be discarded. Ministers were pawns to be used and betrayed. Subjects were fodder for punishment. Even his allies, the nobles who restored him to the throne after Napoleon's exile, soon discovered that loyalty meant nothing when weighed against Ferdinand's paranoia. In public, he projected the image of a pious Catholic monarch. He revived the Inquisition, outlawed liberal reforms, and crushed dissent with fire and steel. But the true engine of his reign was not faith, nor politics, it was humiliation. Every edict, every purge, every execution was, at its core, an attempt to silence the laughter he heard in his head. The impact on Spain was catastrophic. Government decisions were delayed because the king was brooding over imagined slights. Cabinet meetings were postponed while physicians prepared him for yet another failed attempt with his queen. Foreign ambassadors left in disgust, reporting back to Europe that Spain was ruled not by a king, but by a man consumed by shame. What made Ferdinand so dangerous was not simply that he was cruel, but that he believed cruelty was survival. He had learned as a boy that mockery could only be answered with punishment, and as a king, he wielded that lesson on the imperial scale. The fate of millions now depended on the insecurities of one man. Spain had endured weak kings, corrupt kings, even tyrants. But with Ferdinand VII, it faced something new. A monarch whose personal dysfunction metastasized into national policy. His body was deformed, his marriages disastrous, his paranoia boundless, and yet he ruled with absolute power. In the twisted chambers of his mind, every subject was a potential mocker, every ally a betrayer, every wife a conspirator. Thus, the private shame of one man became the public tragedy of a kingdom. And Spain, already fragile, began to collapse under the weight of a bourgeois, whose crown could not conceal the curse that lay beneath his silk sheets. By the time Ferdinand was securely seated on the throne again in 1814, Spain was already broken. 6 years of French occupation had left the nation in ruins, its fields burned, its coffers empty, its colonies restless. The people greeted their king with tears and flowers, convinced that he would be a savior. But instead of rebuilding his shattered realm, Ferdinand turned inward, consumed by the same paranoia and humiliation that had haunted him since adolescence. The result was a reign that historians later called La Década Ominosa, the ominous decade. It was ominous not simply for its repression, but because Spain's future was sacrificed on the altar of one man's insecurities. While revolution swept across Europe, Ferdinand moved in the opposite direction. He abolished the liberal constitution of 1812, restored absolute monarchy, and reinstated the Inquisition. Thousands of reformers, intellectuals, and officers who had fought Napoleon under the banner of freedom were now branded traitors. Their crime was not treason against Spain, but treason against the king's fragile sense of control. Colonies in the Americas seized their chance. Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Colombia all declared independence in rapid succession. And yet Ferdinand, instead of addressing the crises, obsessed over palace gossip, over whether his queen was truly loyal, over whether the world mocked his failures as a husband. While Spanish soldiers bled and died in futile attempts to hold on to the crumbling empire, their king was commissioning new marital devices from artisans in Italy and Germany. Diplomats from across Europe began to whisper that Spain had become a joke. Once the proud empire upon which the sun never set, it was now governed by a monarch whose reputation for grotesque deformity and marital disasters had spread to every court on the continent. Caricatures circulated in Paris and London portraying Ferdinand as a bloated tyrant clutching chains in one hand and bizarre instruments in the other. For his subjects, the mockery abroad only deepened their humiliation at home. The king's paranoia grew more elaborate with each passing year. He believed liberal conspirators were hiding in convents, plotting against him. He ordered the construction of hidden passages throughout the palace so he could spy on his own ministers and his own wife. He demanded multiple food tasters, forcing meals to sit for hours while servants waited to see if poisons would take effect. Government business stalled while Ferdinand obsessed over shadows, over phantom pregnancies, over whether the queen's prayers were sincere or coded signals to foreign powers. The cost was staggering. Spain's economy, already gutted by war, spiraled into collapse. Trade with the Americas evaporated. Agriculture shrank under heavy taxation. Roads fell into disrepair. Ordinary people starved while their king spent fortunes on charlatans who promised miracle cures for his condition. Even loyal supporters began to whisper quietly, fearfully, that perhaps God himself had cursed Spain with this monarch. Inside the palace, fear reigned. Courtiers learned to keep their faces blank, their words cautious, their loyalties fluid. Servants who slipped into nervous laughter could vanish the next morning. Ministers who dared propose reforms were dismissed, exiled, or worse. The court had become a theater of silence, where every gesture was weighed, every glance monitored. Beyond the walls, Spain itself fractured. Rebellions flared in the provinces. Bandits ruled the countryside. Cities simmered with unrest. Yet, Ferdinand believed his greatest danger was not hunger, not revolution, not independence movements, but the possibility that someone might mock him or reveal truths about his condition too shameful for the world to know. And so a paradox emerged. The more he tried to control Spain, the weaker it became. The more he silenced voices at home, the louder they grew abroad. The more he clung to his absolute authority, the faster the empire slipped from his grasp. By the late 1822, Spain was no longer a great power. It was a relic, limping behind the modern nations of Europe, chained to the insecurities of a single broken man. For ordinary Spaniards, Ferdinand's reign meant famine, censorship, and fear. For Spain's colonies, it meant freedom purchased not through the king's strength, but through his negligence. And for history, it meant the slow, humiliating death of an empire that had once ruled the world. By 1830, Ferdinand was a shadow of a man. Years of paranoia, humiliation, and cruelty had eaten away at his body as much as his mind. He suffered tremors, digestive collapse, and nights of endless insomnia, pacing the halls of his palace like a ghost. He raided his wife's chambers at midnight, burst through doors with guards in tow, searching for treason that existed only in his imagination. He drilled peepholes into the walls to watch Maria Christina's every movement, convinced her loyalty could never be trusted. Even his infant daughter, Isabella, whom the world hailed as his heir, became a source of torment. Ferdinand adored her and despised her in equal measure, adored her as the child that secured his dynasty, despised her as living proof that he himself had failed. He studied her features obsessively, commissioning portraits to compare with his own, seeking resemblance where there was none. To the king, Isabella was both salvation and condemnation. By 1833, his decline could no longer be hidden. His speeches rambled into incoherence, laced with accusations against imaginary conspirators. Ministers met not to govern Spain, but to endure his tirades. Physicians, powerless to heal him, described him privately as a man who had already begun to die long before death arrived. The end came quietly. After decades of dramatic scandals and cruelty, Ferdinand slipped into delirium, calling out to his dead wives, demanding investigations into plots that never existed. He died in September 1833, officially of gout, but those who knew him understood the truth. He died of exhaustion, physical, psychological, spiritual. A life consumed by shame had finally consumed itself. The autopsy revealed the secret he had carried for half a century, an organ so grotesquely oversized and deformed that normal function was impossible. Scars from failed self-surgeries marked his flesh, pathetic evidence of desperate attempts to correct what nature had twisted. His remains, especially the preserved organ, were sealed in the Vatican archives, locked away as one of Europe's strangest state secrets. But Spain could not lock away the consequences. Ferdinand left behind a fractured kingdom, a ruined empire, and a legacy of cruelty. His daughter, Isabella II, inherited not just the throne but a nation on the brink of civil war. His reign had demonstrated the terrible truth that the personal can become political, that the shame of one man could corrode the destiny of millions. Ferdinand VII did not achieve greatness, nor glory, nor love. He achieved something darker, immortality as a cautionary tale. His story endures as proof that when absolute power falls into the hands of the broken, the wounds of one body can scar an entire kingdom.